Anybody that was feeling any kind of peacefulness or any kind of exhalation, to use a term that refers to breathing, which one George Floyd was not able to do. In late May, we were reminded of how precarious all of our lives are in general and in particular in the society. And we were reminded that there is literally no peace until there is justice, right? No justice, no peace is not a slogan so much as it is a poetic expression of a fundamental truth of our lives. No justice, no peace.
An ordained minister has decided to give up God for a year.
How the heck do you just up and become atheist after being a pastor?
What I'm most worried about right now is figuring out how I can live openly and honestly.
I am finally free to be me.
I have no idea how to find friends or become a part of a community that's not religious.
What does life look like after church, after religion, after God?
That's it in a nutshell.
This is the Life After God podcast, a conversation on the space between belief and unbelief and beyond, with your host, Ryan Bell.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Life After God podcast. My name is Ryan Bell, and I'm your host. This is episode 90. My guest today is Greg Epstein, humanist chaplain at Harvard and MIT, and a bunch of other stuff that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. We recorded this about 2 weeks ago during the peak of the uprisings around the country, led by Black Lives Matter, the Movement for Black Lives, and others. For me, this was a very cathartic conversation that sort of ranged all over the place, and I think it gets better as it goes along. We'll see what you think. This has been a very difficult few months, to say the least. Personally, and as involved as I am locally, I feel exhausted by the challenges that we're dealing with. I've been doing a lot of reading, trying to continue my education about U.S. history, the part that was left out when I went to school. I wrote something on Monday about this experience of sadness/anger that's my daily companion these past several months. I don't think I even allow myself to acknowledge how I'm feeling until it basically knocks me out for a day. Over the weekend, I read Zakivu Hutchinson's new book, Humanist in the Hood, which is a scalding rebuke of mainstream humanism and a stark wake-up call about the mass marginalization of women, people of color, and especially women of color. Right now I'm reading Angela Saini's amazing book, Superior, A, because I want to, and B, because I'm preparing for a conversation with her in July that will be part of the Secular Student Alliance conference. I'm also about to have a conversation with Catherine Stewart about her book, Power Worshippers, which will also be a part of the Secular Student Alliance conference. I'll put details about that in the show notes. So as I said, Greg Epstein is my guest on this episode. Many of you probably know Greg either from his work at MIT and Harvard, his book, Good Without God, or his writing over the past year at TechCrunch, or maybe some combination of these. If you aren't familiar with his writing, I hope after this conversation you will check it out, and I'll post links, of course, to his work in the show notes. I would be remiss if I didn't say again how important it is that this podcast is made possible by the generous support of listeners who contribute anywhere from $1 to $100 a month to make it possible. I want to especially thank my friend Nathan Watkins, who is the newest advisor level member, and Jose, who just joined as a member last week. Thank you both so much for helping me keep this show going, especially now when times are so tough. If you've been appreciating the podcast, I want to thank you first for tuning in faithfully or even sporadically. That's the whole reason I do this, so you can hear and engage with the conversation. I would be so grateful if you became a supporter. Membership starts at $5 a month. If you want to join this group of highly intelligent and very handsome people who support the show, please visit patreon.com/lifeaftergod. It would also be awesome if you would subscribe to the podcast on whatever app you use, and leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. The reviews on Apple Podcasts especially help others find the show and is a great support to me. Okay, let's get to it. Greg Epstein, welcome to the Life After God podcast.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's great to finally talk to you.
Yeah, it's been way too long overdue. I feel like I've of all the sort of well-known humanists and atheists in the secular community, you're probably one of the last people on my list that I haven't spoken to, and I had this sort of interest in talking to you for so long because I read your book, Good Without God, towards the beginning of my 2014 Year Without God journey, and so anyway, I've just been really intrigued and impressed with the work that you do, and it's good to finally talk to you.
Thank you. Likewise, I've been wanting to talk to you for a few years now. I feel like I've been learning a lot from you and with you politically and socially, as political and social issues become an increasingly large part of my version of humanism personally. And so it's just good to get a chance to talk to you about some of the things that have been on my mind, honestly. Like I think we might get a chance to
let's do that.
To purge some for me to vent about some things that have really been bugging me on this conversation. Mm-hmm. But it's also and it's interesting to know, okay, yeah, you were in 2014. It was right around 2014 that I feel like I kind of hunkered down and focused very much on being locally involved in humanism, creating local humanist community as opposed to going out and doing humanist stuff nationally or internationally, because that had been a big focus of mine previously. And by the time you were getting into this stuff, I was getting a little tired of that, honestly.
Yeah, and I mean that's my impression as well. And I didn't know you before 2014 or know of you, but ever since I've been thinking and talking about these issues myself, I've known of you, but I've always had the impression that you were, sort of focused on, Harvard and the Harvard humanist community, and you didn't really travel that much. And I had that same sort of, I guess, experience when I started into all of this. Everybody's intrigued with the new pastor who left his faith. And so there were no shortage of unpaid speaking appointments. For about 2 years, I ran myself ragged for nothing. Well, not for nothing. I mean, I made a lot of friends, but I was also very, very poor. I had just lost my job as a pastor and was unemployed for large stretches of that. So it's, but I felt good about myself. So I guess there's that, like I was traveling the country, meeting new people and expressing what was on my mind.
Yeah, it was a self-discovery process for you, right?
It was.
Gave you, I think the biggest thing that I got out of the earlier phases of my career that I wouldn't go back to now because it was just too cumbersome of a lifestyle. But what I got out of it was just this, this experience of getting to know and meet and talk with all of these different people that see themselves as humanists or atheists or secular or agnostic or what have you. Just on the one hand, really realizing like I'm not alone in this. And on the other hand, realizing that to any extent that I'm doing it publicly or for a living, there's a responsibility to all those people,
right? To
do it well in a certain way.
So, some of us, some of the listeners don't know you personally and perhaps don't know about your career. So I want to start kind of where I do with so many of my guests and just ask you a little bit about your sort of background. And, I know that, you have sort of a secular Jewish background, but I really don't know much more than that. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing and so forth.
Sure. So I was born in New York City. My family was Jewish, but that was sort of the least interesting thing to me about our family at that point. It wasn't something that we really talked about very much. My mom was a refugee. She came to this country by herself with nothing on 2 days' notice when the communist revolution came to Cuba. And, she was separated from her family because of American immigration policy for over, a couple of years. and really deeply traumatized by that. Although she's an incredible person, vivacious, great sense of humor, very playful, but at the same time, a deeply and fundamentally a survivor of trauma.
Right.
And my dad was a little older by the time I was born and was sick for most of my life until he died when I was 18. So a lot of his life was kind of previous to my birth. He was a kind of spiritual seeker, wanted to be a spiritual teacher, wanted to be a writer for the New York Times, didn't graduate from college, so made it a little hard.
Right. Right.
And, we lived in a neighborhood called Flushing, Queens, New York, that was extraordinarily diverse racially and ethnically, and I think it inculcated this curiosity in me about everybody and everything in the world, and how like the world could be this sort of cross between a Starship Enterprise and a United Nations refugee camp. And yet, I don't think I fully understood until much later how even in a neighborhood where everybody was, sort of poor and creeping up into middle class, and where we all lived in small apartments, and most of our parents were not born in the United States, among all my friends, or were born poor in the United States, how I still had this, what you call white male privilege, because, I still looked the part at a time when that made all the difference. And so, I had this very conflicted vision of myself as a liberal. And, because my mom had escaped violent communism, she was a real liberal. She became a hippie after she learned English, as a teenager, but she, I don't think she could really bring herself to go full on, quote, left, unquote.
Right. I mean, my impression of so many Cuban refugees is that many of them became conservative.
Yeah, no, not my mom, not in any way, shape, or form. Yeah. But, she's no Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or whoever, but, but at the same time, I think there was a fear of ideology.
Right. Okay.
Especially when I was being raised by her, like she now tells me, because I've now become a lot more maybe radical in my politics, and she'll now remind me, your father was really liberal. He wouldn't allow the name Ronald Reagan to be mentioned in our house.
Good for him.
But I just didn't know that version of my dad. I just didn't get to know him that well before he died. And so for me, there was this fear of ideology, because ideology was just scary. It was brutal. It was and it was the kind of thing that could keep us as poor refugees for the rest of our lives. So, there was a kind of pride for my mom in being able to move up and be mainstream and live a decent middle class life, and raise me to feel like I had the opportunity to, quote unquote, do anything or be anything. Mm-hmm. And, the fact that I looked like a typical white male politician at that point in my, young life, didn't help or didn't hurt, depending on how you look at it. I just was raised with this sort of Americanism ideology that even if you're a liberal and you're compassionate towards everybody, and you believe that you should be able to marry anybody, man, woman, black, brown, purple, or polka dot, which is, I think, literally was said to me as a little kid, or, even if, never again, as I was taught about the Holocaust, means never again for anybody.
Right.
There was still a fear of like any ideology might again mean that we would end up destitute.
Yeah, like enslaved to that ideology.
Yeah, and there was this feeling that I wouldn't have to live that life of fear and destitution and just sort of existential dread that my mom, I think, grew up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the dream of classical liberalism. I mean, that it respects everyone. It respects diversity. It's like liberal democracy. You know, it's like protects the minority view. You know, and that's the vision, and it's a beautiful vision.
Yeah,
when it works out.
Although, you know, I was sort of like my mom would tease me when I was a kid that I was a little bit influenced by the Alex P. Keaton character.
Yeah.
In this sitcom Family Ties.
Oh, yeah.
Like this, you know, is this kid Michael J. Fox, right?
Yeah.
Who was being raised by hippie parents, but was pretty conservative as a character. When I was 18 years old, when I turned 18, I registered as a Republican.
Wow.
And my parents were just aghast, absolutely aghast.
That's great. I mean, I think we talk about this a lot, I think, in like conversations that I have about how, you know, conservative parents raise liberal kids, and then liberal parents sometimes raise conservative kids against their will, and both against their will, kind of. And I don't know if it's just children trying to differentiate themselves from their parents and not be just like them, or they're compensating in some way for something they didn't experience or something. I don't know what it is. I'm not a psychologist. But...
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to be the poster child and superhero of American exceptionalism. You know, and I wanted to do that. I mean, I'm talking when I was 18 years old or so, you know, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. So like
right.
The early to mid 90s.
Right.
I wanted to do it in a capital L liberal way. I wanted to be compassionate for all. I wanted to fight for, whether it was gay rights or, you know, racial harmony, diversity was something that I was very big on back then. But I just didn't get it when it came to poverty, when it came to really deep-rooted systemic injustice that even liberal people like me could be advancing.
Right. Even that notion
without
of it
recognizing
systemic.
it. You know, I didn't get how my own preferences and behaviors were causing other people to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for example, when I was a kid growing up in New York City, in junior high school, I went to junior high school near Jamaica, Queens,
mm-hmm.
which is, you know, which at the time was a tough neighborhood, considered a tough neighborhood, quote unquote, in New York City. And I was afraid a lot. I was afraid of being the victim of sort of physical violence. You know, I still to this day don't make good eye contact with people when I meet them, because I learned in junior high school you really had to avoid eye contact or you could get jumped and mugged on the street.
Wow.
And I had stuff stolen from me repeatedly on a bus that I used to take home from Jamaica, or from near Jamaica anyway. You know, like earring taken out of my ear, hat taken off of my head, coat taken off of me, that kind of stuff, and repeatedly. And so that was under Mayor David Dinkins in New York City, who talked about the gorgeous mosaic of diversity in New York. He was the first black mayor of New York City. And then Rudy fucking Giuliani was elected, this liberal Republican at the time, was elected mayor of New York City. And at the time, like young me, I thought he was great.
Yep.
Because he was quote unquote socially liberal at the time.
Mm-hmm. Hard to imagine. I know.
He was. He really was, though. He actually was.
I mean, even after 9/11, you know, that people were singing.
He's gone through a sickening devolution, but still, I didn't recognize how bad he already was back then.
Yeah.
And he believed in this broken windows theory of policing the city and of governing the city, where if there was in his mind a small crime,
right,
you would pursue it and punish it aggressively so as to deter future crime.
Right.
And so from my ignorant, privileged perspective, as a white kid in a quote unquote diverse neighborhood, all of a sudden I felt like less threatened. And the subway started getting cleaned of the graffiti, and there were fewer encounters where I was worried that I was going to get mugged. And I thought, wow, this man's doing a freaking great job. The city's getting better. Look at this. But what I didn't realize, of course, was that a lot of that was happening at the expense of terrorizing Black people.
Right. Better for who?
Yeah. Better for who? It was terrorizing Black people. It was privileging a certain perspective. It was doubling down on white supremacy and on rising inequality.
Yeah.
And, I just didn't get it.
So coming to the present day, you just sort of to get this out of the way, and then we'll try to connect some of the dots. I mean, you're humanist chaplain at both Harvard University and MIT. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I was having fun riffing on my, my childhood and those experiences, because that's stuff I don't usually get to talk about on this podcast. I love, the fact that these are things that you've thought deeply about. But yeah, I mean, to just give listeners a little bit of who the heck I even am. Why am I talking to them about my, childhood, for goodness sake? Like, is this the only thing this guy has to talk about? I was a religion major in college. And because I was fascinated by questions of religion for all sorts of reasons. And then, I became interested in humanism because I discovered the movement of secular humanistic Judaism.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought that was fascinating. And I spent 5 years getting ordained as a secular humanist rabbi.
Oh, wow. I had no idea you were a rabbi.
Yeah. I'm ordained as a rabbi. And so as I was getting trained as a secular humanist rabbi, a rabbi who is explicitly an atheist, I discovered that Harvard had a humanist chaplain. Harvard was the first university ever to have a humanist chaplain. And I got to meet him, and we spent hours together, hours and hours over a course of a weekend. And I realized that that's what I wanted to do with my life. And so I kept in touch with him for a few years, became the assistant humanist chaplain in 2004. He retired a year later, and I took over for him. And so I've been humanist chaplain at Harvard University for 15 years now. And I've been through a whole number of sort of versions of my career and myself during that time. I feel like I've grown up in the position. First as a young chaplain, then as a passionate organizer of other humanists. And I wrote a book when I was still about 30. That was Good Without God. And then started to try to pull together a humanist community movement around the country, and then opened up a community center in Harvard Square. We ultimately raised a few $1 million to spend on a kind of humanist congregation for what we called Atheist Agnostics and Allies, starting in 2013, 2014. And then closed that congregation after about 1,000 meetings in 2018.
I remember so clearly. I was like, wow.
And so we closed that down right as I was adding humanist chaplain at MIT to my portfolio. And when I decided to add MIT, I was invited to become a chaplain at MIT in this new senior role that I have there called Convener for Ethical Life, as well as humanist chaplain at MIT. I started thinking about how MIT is a tech school, and I started thinking about tech. And I had this realization for myself that, whoa, tech is more than even religion. Like, I got into religion because I thought it was the most influential human institution in the world.
Right.
And I wanted to study what really made humans tick. And then I realized, 18 years later, wow, no, tech has eclipsed religion as the most influential human institution that we've ever created. And I want to study it. I want to learn about what it is that we're trying to build and what it is that we're succeeding and failing at building when we're building this thing we call technology. And so I've dived in the past couple of years to really studying not just humanism, but humanism and technology together. And that's just been fascinating. And that's kind of what leads me to you today.
Yeah. And then you've had a run as staff writer for TechCrunch, right?
Yeah, I just finished doing a year as the title they gave me ultimately was ethicist in residence for TechCrunch.
That's dope.
Which means that I was given permission to kind of cover whatever ethical issues in the broader field of tech that I wanted to, whether it was the ethics of AI or gig work or immigration enforcement as it was aided by evil technology, or the future of work, as they call it, which I think of as sort of tech prophecy. Yeah. And that role recently ended because TechCrunch, like a lot of other publications these days, is doesn't have the money for things that it used to have, given the crisis. But yeah, it's been a fascinating journey to work with them.
Yeah, I saw your tweets just today about the unfortunate end of that role.
Yeah, but it, I feel good about it though. I've learned an amazing amount from working at TechCrunch and published like 40 pieces for like 160,000 words. So, I certainly got to put myself out there for them.
That's amazing. And I mean, this is another way, I think, in which your trajectory as a sort of a humanist public intellectual has been a little different than some others. So many in the sort of formal atheist and secular communities are focused on other really important things, not to take anything away from those, but, a lot of lawyers, right, who are doing separation of church and state and really doing their best to like support the wall of separation as it's beginning to sort of erode and crumble. And, I've been reading Catherine Stewart's book, and she's going to be a guest on the show. And then in a few
she's great.
weeks.
She's a friend, and I love what she does.
Yeah, she's fantastic. We've had a few conversations. She's going to speak at the Secular Student Alliance conference this summer, and she's going to be on the show. And I mean, it's just she's compiled and like sort of synthesized so much history and also current events in that. So there's a lot of people in the secular community that are doing that work, which is really important. And then there's, of course, like the sort of straight ahead type atheist type of stuff. And then, I mean, there are people like James Croft who are doing ethics work as a congregational leader. But it's not as often. I mean, I feel like when the other area of the secular community is science, right? And tech is sort of like the close cousin to science. And they tend to be, I was shocked when I left religion and left my faith and sort of found my way into this weird community that we're a part of, and found like how optimistic everyone was about the future, because I was sort of raised to be quite pessimistic about the future, pessimistic, but like prophetically optimistic. Like the world was doomed, but God was going to save us, in a nutshell.
Right. Yeah. It's doomed for everybody else, but for us, because we're going to be saved, it's going to be great.
It's going to be great. Yeah. So for me, the huge part of the emotional processing of my sort of onset of atheism was really doing the work of what I would call growing up, like realizing that no one's coming to save me. I'm on my own.
As Roxane Gay recently wrote for the New York Times, like, recognize that nobody's coming to save us from coronavirus and from systematic racism. So I just love the echo of that.
Yeah. And this is what this for me was a profound, I mean, raised in a conservative Christian sect. It was for me always this, I always thought of God as this kind of backstop. Like no matter what happens, there's at least this sort of promise. And I describe humanism as learning to live without promises. And then I would, I heard Michio Kaku speak once, and I've, read some Steven Pinker, and I was a, fan of Sam Harris for a long time. And I was like, wow, these people have a sort of almost like a religious faith in technology to save the world. And I just couldn't, especially, and I mean, I don't know, I'm certainly no educated critic of Michio Kaku. I really don't know much of anything. You would know much more about him, but I heard one like big lecture at an auditorium here in Pasadena, and I was like, wow, how does he have so much confidence in the future? Maybe I'm missing something. So I read a book or so of his, but I don't think there are very many humanists out there writing and speaking about sort of almost the pessimistic side of kind of where this could go if we don't pay close attention to how we are implementing new developments in science and technology.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think hasn't changed for me with all the evolution that I feel like I've been through as a humanist, what hasn't changed is I got involved with humanism and declared myself to myself as a humanist because of a fascination with what it is to be a human being.
Right.
With this feeling of, wow, I'm human and we're human and we have a sense of what that means and we get to explore it. And I wanted to and still want to explore my own humanness in any and every way that I can figure out how to do so. But the change to me has been this, going from a sense of of liberalism will redeem humanity to a sense of how much work we all really have to do. And how buried under some thousands and thousands of years of mistakes we are, along with all the good that we've done and the things that we've learned.
I love that. I mean, there's so much humility there, and I find humility in such short supply really everywhere. One of the criticisms that I onboarded pretty quickly as a new atheist, not a capital N, capital A new atheist, but as a fresh new atheist.
Yeah, like a baby vampire. Right?
Exactly. I hadn't learned the ways of the Force yet, but was just the critique that Christians have a kind of arrogance about their beliefs, and I again, any broad sweeping generalization is not going to apply to everyone, of course, but I could recognize a certain kind of arrogance in my own Christianity and my own sense of knowing the truth and having this confidence in my faith. But lo and behold, that arrogance shows up all over the place, whether it's a sort of a scientific arrogance. You can almost imagine, these early race scientists, in the late 19th, early 20th century, so confident that they had really figured out what race is, and had really, cracked the code, or the eugenicists who are like figured out, they're so confident in their scientific research that they can, breed defects out of humans the way that people try to do with other things. And then there's arrogance in a kind of a philosophical arrogance around atheism and as well that crops up all the time, and it's a little disheartening.
Well, let me speak about arrogance here from a place of personal experience, right? Not to say that I'm a formerly arrogant person or a deconverted arrogant person.
That would be arrogant of you to say.
I'm sure I'm still an arrogant person in many ways, but I think it's safe to say, as somebody who used to be a hell of a lot more uncontrollably arrogant than I currently am, I think arrogance is all about fear. I think, for example, not to say that I was technically a narcissist or that anybody's technically a narcissist, but we all have some degree of narcissism, whether healthy or and unhealthy narcissism. Mm-hmm. And really, we forget that the technical definition of narcissism is really it's kind of a state in which a person is in so much pain for feeling inadequate, for feeling unworthy of love, of compassion, of care, that they can't even bear to feel that much of self-hatred and self-doubt. And so they overcompensate it by not feeling those feelings on a conscious level at all, and instead bringing into their conscious mind and into their interactions with other people a total overcompensation and self-love, self-pride, whatever.
Right.
And it, that's I think at the heart of what a lot of what we call arrogance. It's people feeling inadequate, feeling self-hatred, feeling self-loathing and doubt, and they manifest it in this overconfidence that kills.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And I think the more, again, here comes humanism. I think being self-aware, understanding who we are in relationship to one another, but also in relationship to ourselves, is an ongoing, lifelong process. Like, we never really, like the idea that, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in our world. It would be weird of us to talk tonight and not really.
Well, I feel like we're already talking about it.
We really are, right? Which is what I'm thinking, which is that, like, for me to think that I'm going to one day, and I know some people are going to really hate this, but for me to think that one day I'm going to just not be a racist in that subtle, I don't mean by racist, I don't mean like outwardly hateful towards people of color. I mean, those internalized, like what you said about your childhood growing up, like you benefited from white privilege long before you ever knew or anyone was using that language.
Before I even understood what it was to be a white person.
Right, exactly. To even understand I remember having that conversation with someone early on in my own sort of self-understanding where they said to me, what does it mean for you to be white? Like, what does whiteness mean to you? And I didn't even understand what the question was. I was like, it doesn't mean anything to me. And they're like, exactly. It doesn't mean anything to you. Like, you don't even know.
Yeah.
That.
Yeah, you're a fish, you're swimming in the water, and you've just been asked what's water like.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas people of color every day are faced with their differentness, their otherness, and what that means for them politically and socially.
Right.
And so, obviously anyone listening to this, when it comes out, we're just on the 2 weeks post the death of George Floyd, and 2 solid weeks of uprisings around the country and around the world, frankly, protesting police violence, but more than police violence, really the way that white supremacy hasn't gone away, and that we, I think, as white liberals have sometimes consoled ourselves that we have sort of eliminated these things and we've moved beyond them, and they've just gone underground, and we've done better at coming up with euphemisms for things and sort of masking over what's really happening, and then it bursts out, right? When the pressure builds, it just explodes. And I think one of the things we're grappling with at the Secular Student Alliance, that certainly I'm thinking about, is what does it mean to be secular or humanist in this moment? What are you thinking about that?
Well, I as a white male who is secular and humanist in this moment, I think that there's some parallel between the two for me, because I was raised with a sense of myself as the hero. There's a famous book by a psychologist, a mythologist named Joseph Campbell, called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, which was a kind of Bible for me as a teenager and in my very early 20s. And, it was the idea that each person is on the hero's journey.
Right.
As represented, whether, it's by the story of Moses in the Hebrew Bible, or of Jesus in the New Testament, or of Luke Skywalker, or, Optimus Prime, or whoever. Right.
Right.
And what I didn't realize was that I assumed that about myself, but I didn't necessarily know how to give a shit whether that was equally true for other people. I mean, it wouldn't have taken me too much effort to look around and really feel deep pain at the fact that other people, just by the fact that they didn't look like me, and and they weren't socialized like me, like they didn't have access to that myth that in my mind was supposed to be for, quote, all humans, unquote. And it's interesting because a lot of the people who up to this point in history, not necessarily in the future, but up to this point in history, a lot of the people who have affiliated themselves with the, quote, secular movement, unquote, do have similar background to you and I, and were raised to think of themselves as the hero, and were raised to look at Luke Skywalker on the screen and think that can and should be me, and it will be me, and it is me. Right. In some way, and so we're now kind of sidelined as a movement, because I don't think there's really any scenario in 2020 where we, the people that currently constitute the organized secular movement, end up as the heroes in the story of what the hell is going on in the United States right now.
Right.
We can be an important, role player. We can be supporting actors, but we're not the hero of this story, and nothing that we can do will or should make us into the hero. And in fact, the more that, if we try, like, the humanist movement, we humanists, like, we're going to try to be the hero of all of this now, like, that would make us into colossal assholes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've seen it in other sort of activist movements right now, this, in the nonprofit world, as you well know, everyone's always trying to raise money. And it's been really remarkable to see nonprofits that are not focused on racial justice say, please donate to these 5 Black activist organizations, or there's been, I think, a real outpouring of solidarity. It's certainly not perfect, yes. But yeah, I think you're right, especially in the fundraising world and all of that. Like, we're always trying to paint ourselves as the ones without whom this would all go to shit, right? So, and that does feed a certain kind of narcissism, as you say, and a certain kind of self-importance that it can be really destructive when combined with latent white supremacy and white privilege that in fact, I just, I'm very involved in local politics here in Pasadena, California, and I'm a part of the tenants union, and our tenants union is really diverse, and there's no official leader. It's a very flat structure. We're all volunteers. We have sort of conveners of committees, but those even rotate and change. So there's no hierarchy. So, we're all pitching in to get stuff done. And just recently, one of the Black tenants was doing some work and asked for my help on something. And instead of just helping her with what she asked me to do, I also misunderstood some things. But so first of all, my misunderstanding of what she needed, which probably grew out of my haste in not trying to thoroughly understand what she needed. And then I went beyond what she asked me to do some other things to what I thought would help and to fix things, right? And then there's a little bit of heat coming back to me from her, and I didn't understand it, and I was like, well, I was just trying to help. And so we had a conversation that was pretty intense, and I went away from that conversation for about 3 days of introspection, all the while protests around the death of George Floyd are happening, right? And I'm like sitting with my arrogance. I'm sitting with my assumption that, I'm going to fix this. Even if it's, I don't know, like spell checking a document or something. Like nobody asked me to do that. That's not necessarily my role. But I just assumed that I could step into that role. And it's not, I'm not saying it's always wrong to see a need and fill it, but.
Well, I mean, it's also like, it's not that we're saying, I think that, white men are the only people who are capable of arrogance or narcissism or anything else. I mean, we're all human at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's just that by being told and then by telling yourself that you're in a special class of people, that actually ends up making us more likely to make certain kinds of mistakes. That's all.
Yeah.
So, it's like one thing that I really liked, that was tweeted by, the scientist and writer, Shonda Prescott Weinstein, one of my favorite writers, was, she's a real radical, on Twitter and in life. And she said, it's not that the fact that countries with women leaders, are doing better under COVID means that, women leaders are necessarily better. It's that countries that are open to having women leaders are necessarily better.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, because they have crossed a kind of threshold.
Yeah, where they're not, they don't give a damn about, this myth that it has to be a man anymore. They're just open to the best leadership, the best collaboration, the best cooperation that it can be. And sometimes it'll be men in those roles. Sometimes it'll be women. Sometimes it'll be, non-binary folks. But the point is that the point is to lead the community in the best, most effective, most compassionate way possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really insightful. So, I mean, where are you focusing your energies right now? Like, how are you thinking about your own personal development or in the last couple of weeks, but also like your public self? Like, where are you feeling led, or that's a very sort of Christian thing to say.
No, I like it though. It's
feeling
fun.
inspired, I guess, to be involved. And maybe where are you recognizing that it's not your place to be involved? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm more probably reflecting my own.
Yeah. No, I mean, with the not my place to be involved, I mean, one thing, for example, is just that I've really struggled in the past couple of weeks with being afraid to put my family in danger. Where I do feel really scared for my family around coronavirus and just feeling like, I don't know that I'm ready to take us out into the streets yet, because I'm just, I'm scared that we'll get sick.
Right.
But at the same time, and I have a very young son, and I've been, in a lot of ways, playing the primary caregiver role in my family unit.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was more like I can't get myself sick because, I'm the one that this kid looks to for care on a day-to-day basis,
right,
more than anybody else. So that's been hard for me, because I feel like, well, it's a lot harder on a lot of other people, and maybe I should take more risks than I'm taking.
Right.
Even though he's too young, I in my judgment, to be safe out at a protest just yet.
Right.
And so, but again, a lot of people are fundamentally unsafe. And so what's my responsibility? That's just something that I just think a lot about.
Me
I struggle
too.
with.
Yep.
So, well, what I'll say is this, I was granted by, the board of directors that governs the humanist chaplaincy at Harvard and MIT. They granted me a 12-month paid fellowship. They offered me 6 months of on my full pay, which, by the way, and ain't that much, but that's another thing. 6 months of my full pay, or 12 months of half of my pay, to go and explore this concept of humanism and technology. And I I was surprised to take 12, that I found myself wanting to take 12 months away, because I really had been a workaholic for the longest time. And my whole identity was around that job.
Yeah.
And at first to step away from it in this major way felt really weird. But in a sense, I now understand that that's why they gave me the option of the sabbatical in the first place. It was because, I think that the people that I work for knew that it would be healthy for me to begin to see myself in some other ways, and that I'd actually be able to do a better job for them and for our communities, having broadened my horizons. And so I was researching technology and writing about technology. At one point, I got to break national news about technology, or really speak to a lot of people that you call that my editors called the Silicon Valley elite, about what it is that they're trying to build. And I loved that. And I was developing all these different stories, and I was like really getting to the point where my ability to write a book about that from a humanist perspective was peaking right as COVID hit.
Wow.
And so a lot of that had to be put on hold. There's a day in sort of early mid-March where Harvard and MIT just shut down.
Yep.
And I realized that day, 9/11 and the Boston Marathon bombing were big days in my personal life, as in addition to the life of the nation. And I was on campus sort of both of those days. Actually, I was at the marathon when the bombing hit. But I immediately sort of walked back and started getting to work on campus issues that day. And I realized immediately that this was going to be, at the very least, the third big day in my professional life. And, it maybe has turned out to be the biggest of them all. So I at that point, I immediately put my sabbatical on sabbatical, and got into this business of how does a chaplain of any kind, much less a humanist chaplain, help people in an environment where people are just looking around, afraid, confused, uncertain, unmoored, devastated, suffering, et cetera, et cetera. And I just threw myself into that work, and making it even weirder was the fact that I had been studying the ethics of technology, but I had to do all of that chaplaincy work mediated by technology, because I couldn't see anybody. So here I am on Twitter and Facebook and Zoom and Microsoft and all these companies that I had been studying how deeply flawed they are ethically and humanistically. And now I'm restricted to the use of them to do anything at all.
Really illustrating how enslaved we are to that stuff.
Yeah. It's illustrating my thesis that tech has become the largest religion that human beings have ever created. And we are, the God of tech is so clever and so powerful that he doesn't even give a damn whether we worship him consciously or not, because he knows that we unconsciously worship him. And it's a smarter strategy than any God ever before has designed. And obviously I'm being metaphorical here, right? Like, I don't believe that there's ever been a real deity, but metaphorically, this is a powerful freaking deity.
Yeah.
And so, it was this bizarre experience for a few months. And, I had just been saying to my board in May, like, okay, guys, I've been working in March and April and now May on helping people. But I think it's starting to get to the point where we're kind of digging in for the long haul. And so if you don't mind, in June, I'm going to go back to my sabbatical and keep writing my book, because I think June, July, August are going to be a little more quiet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry to laugh, but as soon as I'd said that, and I had just turned in a first draft of an op-ed for the Boston Globe that was meant to sort of summarize my experience on sabbatical from sabbatical, meant to summarize my experience of 3 months of chaplaincy from afar, under social distancing. and George Floyd is murdered.
Mm.
And first degree murdered, by the way, in case anybody wants to know my opinion on that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as far as I can tell, anyway.
Right. As far as anyone can ever tell intention.
Yeah. And so here we are. Here all of us are, right? It's not just about me. This is like anybody that was feeling any kind of normalcy whatsoever. And we all know how I know, and I think how problematic the word normal is in this context.
Right.
But anybody that was feeling any kind of peacefulness or any kind of exhalation, to use a term that refers to breathing, which one George Floyd was not able to do.
Right.
In late May, we were reminded of how precarious all of our lives are in general and in particular in the society.
Yeah.
And we were reminded that there is literally no peace until there is justice, right? No justice, no peace is not a slogan so much as it is a poetic expression of a fundamental truth of our lives. No justice, no peace.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you see it repeated throughout history. The underclass can only take so much, and then this injustice manifests itself in a disruption of the peace. Just in our lifetimes, we've seen it repeatedly. It's really a bizarre moment, and I think a moment for both, this sort of praxis principle that I try to implement in my own life, of action and reflection. And so I'm acting a lot. I'm doing a lot in, for instance, today, our public safety committee of city council met to talk about civilian oversight of the police department, which they had shelved 4 years ago, and which I campaigned on, bringing that conversation back, and it was brushed aside repeatedly. Not even brushed aside is actually the right way to put it, because it wasn't even seriously considered. Like, there was one of the sort of boilerplate questions that we would get asked at forums, and they would say, well, our police department's doing good. And it is doing better than some, right? But, today they met to open up the conversation again about civilian oversight. And, we were, one of the groups I work with in the city, organized a bunch of public comments. There was probably 2 hours of read, they were still meeting on Zoom and everything. And so, like, city staff read out loud 2 hours of public comments in 2 major chunks, not all together, but it was really an outpouring, and some of those comments were like, I unequivocally support the police and we need to give them more money, so there were those comments as well. But so there's the action part, like, where it's like, this is, the iron is hot and can be molded, in these moments. And then there's also, for me at least, and I'm sure for so many people, maybe everyone, this desire to really go back and educate myself about things that I didn't learn as a younger person, about the riots in the 60s and civil unrest even in the 90s. So in the 90s, when the Rodney King beating happened and those police officers were exonerated by the court, I was at a fundamentalist Bible college in Northern California, and my dad lived in Southern California. And to my shame, I barely remember it even happening. Like, I remember that it happened, and I remember seeing the video of him being beat up by those cops when the video came out, but it didn't even register on my radar as a human being what was happening. That's how isolated and shut away from society. It's possible.
I mean, there are a lot of bubbles in this country.
Yeah.
And it's really possible to live inside of one.
Yeah.
For at least for a long period of time until it pops.
Yeah.
But one thing that I really admire about what you're doing now, and that in some ways I'm intrigued by the possibility of emulating what you're doing right now, is your involvement very much from a humanist perspective as I see it, in local civic life and local progressive politics.
Right.
That it has occurred to me, and we both read or have engaged with Martin Haglin's book This Life, and I know you did a great interview with him, and you've spoken really powerfully about things related to that, the issues that he brings up, but this idea that I used to believe that the best way that a humanist involved in the humanist movement could express a commitment to humanist values and a humanist movement was through building a local community of humanists.
Right.
I spent a decade dedicating my life to the emulation of the religious congregation by atheists and agnostics, from a specifically humanist perspective. And I'm proud of a lot that was accomplished under that banner and that rubric. But I have come more to believe at the moment, not that anybody should stop doing that work.
Mm-hmm.
If they feel motivated to, and they feel like they've got a good context to do it in, because I think it's still great work. But for myself, anyway, for me personally, I've come to feel that the best way that I know to express my commitment to these things that we call humanist values and this movement that we call humanism, is by getting involved in the messy, step-by-step, often plagued by hypocrisy and compromise and rancor and ignorance, but still this work of building a demos, of building a democracy, of building a system of jurisprudence, of laws, by which we govern our society, of building a dialogue among humans around science and critical thinking, and just incrementally making life better through more cooperation, collaboration. And like humanists, again, I don't think that we're ever, at least in the short term, and going to be the stars, the heroes in a classical sense of that work. But on an optimistic note, I think that we can be significant players,
right,
in the ensemble cast that kind of work requires.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we can be, as a movement, we can get involved in civic work and be one of the actors in the show that people really show up excited to hear and see.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that as a movement, we actually are very well disposed to some of the key ideas that need to be upheld in order to have a functioning democracy.
Yeah. No, I think that's really profound. And I mean, even when I was a Christian, I felt this sense that it was very difficult for people to keep attention of, we would describe ourselves as a community for the sake of the world. And and I think it's easy to err in one direction or the other. Like, to be a community, this inward facing sort of, to, I guess, put a little bit of a pejorative label on it, kind of this kumbaya experience where we feel good about ourselves and our relationships with one another, which is super important, of course. Like, I thrive on healthy relationships with others. I wouldn't be the person I am tomorrow if they ended right now. It would affect me immediately. But then to see those things as not existing for their own sake, but for from my Christian days, for the blessing of the world, or for, in more secular terms, I think for the betterment of society, to create more peace and more equity and more harmony more thriving, human flourishing. Not just human flourishing from like a mind trick where we learn some positive psychology tricks and make ourselves feel better, but actual material improvements to people's lives, which then yield that sort of positive feeling that we all crave, that dopamine hit that we're all looking for. And I do worry that I gave a talk at the American Humanist Association a few years ago at their convention about materialism and humanism, basically Marxism and humanism. And I said, I feel like humanism is currently, and maybe always has been, I don't know, but there have been pockets of radicalism. But I think by and large, humanism has been too concerned with like bourgeois interests, of human thriving of the sort that can exist when you're well off and well put together and have a good education. And we talk about science, and we talk about, community service, which is this kind of like simplistic giving back, philanthropy. I know you spent some time with Anand, and his book Winners Take All, and that type of sort of liberal thinking around what it means to be humanistic, instead of saying, look, as atheists, we don't think there's any supernatural. So, and not all atheists are materialists, but let's just say for the sake of simplicity that there's a kind of a generic materialism going on when you don't have a sense of super materialism, like there's no sort of outside there, and so then the only thing that we can affect, if we don't believe in a spiritual realm that we can affect, the only thing we can affect as people is the physical realm in which we live, which means if we want people to be happier, we should help them make more money. Like we should give them a better minimum wage. We should give them health care. That's how we make people happier, not by teaching them some meditation trick or some kind of McMindfulness or something, And the mindfulness can be helpful along the way, but I think,
the mindfulness is I mean, at times is taught to, let's say, poor people, marginalized people, to help them cope with their stress. But usually what the mindfulness ends up being is something that's taught to the privileged people to help them learn an extremely effective technique for drowning out their doubts as to whether or not they're actually oppressing the other people that don't have access to such wonderful opportunities to just sit and meditate.
Right, the ethical rationality of what they're doing. Who?
Harris.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like, or 10% happier. That guy, like.
I'll give Dan Harris a little bit more of a pass than I give Sam.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Dan and I have had some good interactions, and I think he's trying a little harder than Mr. Sam Harris is to explore that stuff. But
I'll give a little plug to one of my favorite podcasts these days is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson, and they I think they're like the rational version of like the dirtbag left, in a way. Like, I think they have the potential to be the dirtbag left, but they don't. They're like very thoughtful, very like deep research. And they recently did an episode on positive psychology and sort of its historical roots and the way that it's used to prop up the status quo. And it was pretty revealing. And
mea culpa in a lot of ways. Like I was part of that too.
Sure, me too.
I was absolutely part of that too. I'm sure I'm still part of it in a lot of ways that I'm still trying to process and work on. It's hard. I think one thing that I'd like to have a whole separate conversation with you about at some other point is I find myself obsessing a lot about what it would look like. Like, okay, so what is our life actually going to be like if and when it is more just and more equitable? And I will say this, like, the optimistic, hopeful side of me on that question, sort of looks at pandemic life and thinks like, okay, well, maybe there are some things from here that we can take from it. Like I was talking to my mom today, is my mom's now in the house with us, trapped here, as opposed to being trapped in New York by herself where she was.
Mm-hmm.
And I was saying, like, okay, you know, we really do probably eat better food and enjoy our food more now under the pandemic than we did before. And she said, yeah, I think so too. And it's this idea that we have a lot fewer options now about how to eat and what to eat and where to eat. And it raised some hope for me that the fact that one has more options does not necessarily mean that one will have a better and more meaningful or more enjoyable life. And in fact, sometimes it can actually mean the opposite, right? But you don't want to take options away from people without regard for their agency and their, you know, their needs.
Yeah, or just for the sake of it or whatever.
It's a fine line, you know, I may be farther left than I ever was, but I still am the child of a refugee from Castro's communism, and I never want to end up as Stalin, you know, like, and so, you know, who gets to decide what gets taken away is something that I'm concerned with, and I think we really, really need a healthy, democratic, egalitarian, compassionate dialogue around, so that we can figure it out together, as opposed to just, you know, stripping rights from people or being stripped of our rights.
Yeah, no, it's a really important conversation. And I think I crave that conversation too, because I don't have like answers, you know, of course, but it would be great to have a group of people to think with about that, and not only what it would look like, but how we get from here to there, and what kind of engagements need to happen now in order to
maybe that's what a big part of the humanist and secular movement looks like in the next 10 to 20 years. Maybe we really work hard, a lot of us together, on thinking about those questions, and we make a really meaningful contribution to civic life more broadly in this country and beyond by being passionate and forward thinking about finding answers and solutions that work on some of those questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant insight, and I think, you know, vision, I think, of where this could go and where I hope it may go. And we're not going to bring everyone with us. I think that's obvious already. I think people are, you know, the secular communities famously fractured in the last, 5 years around various social issues and social justice warriors and whatnot. But I've really come to terms with that and really felt like I'm kind of okay with it.
Yeah,
with it
I'm not trying to build common ground overly hard.
No, I'm not either. It's like there's plenty of people with whom we can have this conversation.
I mean,
already.
Put it this way. If there's some atheist young person at Harvard or MIT where I serve as chaplain, and they're a libertarian or a Republican or whatever, but they are suffering from some issue that directly relates to their atheism, their secularism, or whatever. And it's not about their politics, but it's about like whether it's discrimination against them because they're an atheist, or whether it is they're suffering because their parents are shunning them, or their family shunning them because they're an atheist, or they're trying to take a religion class and they're not being given full equal treatment by their professor because they're coming at it from an atheist perspective. Like, I will fight for that person so hard, and I will not care that their politics and mine are different.
Right.
They're my people. That's my job. And I will fight for them until they're given better treatment, no matter what.
Of course.
But beyond that kind of incident where I'm doing my job, when it comes to like personal preference issues and sort of what kind of broader movement am I trying to build, I'm okay with the fact that not everybody is going to like this kind of version of humanism that you and I are talking about today.
Right. And I think we just have to be okay with that and just forge on. And I think people will see it. Not everyone's an early adopter. And I think as it builds, and because I also think leftists, and I'm not trying to say you're a leftist, but I think leftists have a lot to learn still about what it would mean to be in the center. You know, like if the left ever had power in this country, they have to now govern, you know, and not just be rabble rousers from the margins. And I think that's a huge shift and something that we're a long ways away from still. Well, I have taken up a lot of your night, and
this is great. This is great. I love talking to you. I'd be very curious to see how your audience, you know, receives the conversation, and if people have questions, comments, whatever, I hope they'll find me on Twitter and, you know, tweet their thoughts at me. I would love to engage further around these things.
Well, Greg, thanks so much for taking the time tonight and just sort of rambling with me about so many different topics. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll have to do it again soon.
Yeah. I love talking to you, Ryan. Keep up the wonderful work. I'm so glad that you're out there doing it. You give me strength by what you're doing, and you know, look forward to talking again.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you made it all the way to the end. A little bit longer episode today, but I hope it was worth it. I listened back through this episode a week or so after recording it, and one of the things that really stood out to me was Greg's comments about the much talked about hero's journey, and his realization that this is not a time in which many of us who have lived with massive privilege are going to be the heroes of the stories being written right now. Mainstream organized humanism, which, by the way, gets a massively deserved dressing down in Sakivu's new book, is not going to be the hero of the story being written right now in the United States. There's a lot to process there for me, and maybe for you too, and I hope you'll take the time to do that work and let me know how it goes. Anyway, I'd love to hear what you thought of this episode. Please write to me at ryan@lifeaftergod.org. Perhaps, as you were listening, you thought of someone who should hear this. Please share it with them. The single greatest way people find out about the Life After God podcast is from listeners like you sharing it with their friends and family, sharing it on social media, and just passing the word along. To learn more about Life After God and to link up with our social media accounts and just stay in touch, please visit our website at lifeaftergod.org. There you can join our email newsletter and browse the back catalog of episodes that's always available to you for free. If this podcast is meaningful to you and has been a source of inspiration, please join the group of members and patrons who make it possible by visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/lifeaftergod. The price of a coffee per month goes so much further than you can imagine and grows the total base of contributors. In this way, more people take what we're doing seriously, and we reach a wider audience. Thank you again for tuning in, and seriously, drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, my name is Ryan Bell, and this has been the Life After God podcast.